Hello, my name is Scott Dusenberry, and I'm going to be doing my presentation on Andrew Loog Oldham. He was the main manager for the Rolling Stones. He kind of invented their entire image, so I figured he would be an interesting person to look into. I also apologize in advance. My throat's a little bit sore, so if my voice sounds unusual or scraggly, I apologize. So, getting started, we'll start with his birth and early life. He was born on January 29th in 1944 in England. His father was an airman, Andrew Loog, who was originally from Texas, and he died during World War II before Oldham was born. His mother was Cecilia Oldman, who worked as a nurse and singer during the war and ended up raising Oldham alone. So, on top of that, Oldham was an illegitimate child because Loog was actually married and he had a child of his own back in Texas. So that kind of created an unusual beginning because illegitimate children and single mothers were definitely very looked down upon in this time period in both American history and European history. So definitely a rough starting point. And on top of that, then on top of that, he was also born during the World War II, one of the most devastating periods in human history. And the years following that weren't much better. I mean, England went through one of its hardest economic downturns in history, and it was just a really difficult time for his early childhood. But his mother and him managed to pull through. His mother was actually estranged from the rest of her family, so Oldman didn't get to know them very well. It was something he actually made note of. For example, her brother and her were on such bad terms that when the war ended, his mother never made any effort to find out if he was still alive because she said it didn't matter. And so she kind of had a similar attitude to the rest of the family. Oldham was the only exception. She very much doted on her son. So Oldham actually felt appreciative that Celia loved him so much, particularly in comparison to the rest of the family. She eventually got a boyfriend. His mother eventually got a boyfriend named Alec Morris, which served as the father figure for his life throughout his early life. And this was kind of an even more unusual situation because Morris himself was married and had two children of his own. But despite this, despite the fact that he was cheating on his wife, he had a great deal of affection for Celia, and he also had a great deal of affection for Oldham, to the point where he made sure that Oldham went to the best schools and was well educated, and kind of doted on him and took care of him, despite the fact that he already had another family. So Morris kind of referred to them as their second family, and Oldham himself didn't think it was anything unusual, viewing it as it was best, a great situation for everyone involved. So he definitely had an unusual look at the world and his family life. I think partially because of the nature of his family life during his formative years. He was also a bit of a problem child. He got into trouble a lot. A good example is he got expelled from one school because he was blackmailing his fellow students by stealing their pencil cases, which were required by the school, and then selling them back to them on the threat that if they didn't have them, the kids would get in trouble. So he was definitely a problem child, going into places he wasn't supposed to, doing things he wasn't supposed to. But his mom and Morris managed to keep him out of the worst stuff. As for becoming a manager, Morris was inspired by rock and roll as a child. He loved the new music coming out of the United States, which is where rock and roll originated at the time. He didn't think England was nearly as good at it, but they still had some fun stuff. And he was actually so inspired by it that he tried to write a rock and roll hit when he was 12 to try to avoid school. He wanted to make a whole bunch of money off this one hit so he didn't have to go back to school and he could just do what he wanted. It didn't quite pan out that way. Obviously, he kind of wrote this almost plagiarized song and then went to the main entertainment street in London and tried to sell it, and it didn't really work. He was actually very shocked because he had this big romanticized view of the street and the music industry as a whole, and it wasn't the case when he got there. But it didn't. It was definitely something that changed his view, but it didn't crush his dreams or his view of the music industry. So he kept with it, actually. He ended up participating in various musical and film clubs when he was going through school in his formative years, and even started his own band while he was still in school. And even after he was in school, he kept doing various jobs, small jobs, and playing in a number of very small bands that weren't overtly successful because he loved music so much. He tried to keep with it. And while he definitely didn't make it as a musician, it did give him some of the experience that would be useful later in life. After his failed musical attempts, he ended up becoming a publicist, and eventually he came under the tutelage of Brian Epstein, who was the manager of the Beatles. And this gave him a lot of credentials and a lot of useful skills. He ended up meeting them at a function, was so impressed by the Beatles and Epstein for their charisma and confidence, and Epstein was willing to give him a job because he needed someone to beat the footpath through London, as he put it, because he hated, or Epstein himself hated London, so he needed someone on the ground to go and promote them, and that ended up being Oldham because he, it was what he wanted to do. It was a foot in the door. So after his work with the Beatles and the experience he gained, he ended up hearing about a small band called the Rolling Stones that he really interested in. They had a good sound. They seemed to be they were still small, but they seemed to be getting good reviews. They seemed like they might be popular someday. And so he asserted himself into their social circles and convinced them to make him the manager, breaking a previous deal, like a handshake deal, with the band's old manager to do so. So that was his first real job as a manager, was with the Rolling Stones. Some notable talent he worked with. He obviously worked with the Beatles, as I said, under Epstein, and that gave him a lot of really good early experience. But his biggest stars that he ever worked with was the Rolling Stones, which included the megastar Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, both of whom are still very successful today. After he had a falling out with the Rolling Stones, he worked on some other projects, very much smaller. One of which was Donovan, and another one which was Humble Pie, a singer and band respectively that were popular in England at the time. And he worked with some other popular bands while he was with the Stones, but those were the ones he worked with afterwards, and he eventually fell out of the manager industry and ended up doing some other stuff. But he definitely had a unique style, something that not a lot of other people had. He had a willingness to get his hands dirty, like when he was working with the Beatles, walking around basically door to door promoting them. That's not something a lot of other people would do, but he was willing to do it. He got his hands dirty, and even in later times when he was a manager, he was very much hands on, working personally with the band. He wasn't very aloof like some of the other managers of the time and even today. So he was definitely willing to get down there and get into the grit of things. He also encouraged his artists to try new activities outside their comfort zones. Like, for example, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards weren't songwriters originally, but Oldham encouraged them to write songs, trying to give them an appreciation of the process, and his encouragement actually resulted in them writing some of the band's most successful hits. So definitely something that worked. He also did a lot of counter branding. He specifically branded the Rolling Stones against the branding of the Beatles rather than trying to copy them like a lot of the other a lot of the other bands at the time. And so definitely something different than everybody else was doing, but something that really worked because it resonated with the more rebellious younger crowd of that era. And he was also very informal in his behavior and his methods. He almost took the band's reputation to heart in a way because he was very much the rebel, partially because of his upbringing, but he was very much different than a lot of the other people in how he did things. Some the key takeaways I took from this were sometimes standing against something is better than standing with everyone. The way he counterbranded it just proves that sometimes doing what's different is better than doing what everyone else seems to be wanting. Sometimes they don't know what they want until they see it. Going against the flow can yield surprising results. Again, he definitely did some unusual things getting to his position as a manager, but that worked for him. So sometimes you can find unusual paths to get what you want. And finally, never be afraid to encourage your artists to expand their horizons. Those hits that Mick Jagger and Keith Richards had wrote never would have happened without him telling them to write songs. So that's the biggest takeaway for me is always try to push your horizons. Always try to get your artists to push their horizons because you never know what's going to happen. With that, I think that's adequately sums up Oldham. He was an excellent manager, in my opinion. These were the resources that I used for him. These were the books and articles and things like that I used. And then these were the resources for the images that I used during the presentation. So I hope everyone enjoyed it, and I hope everyone now has a greater appreciation for Oldham because I certainly do.